Well, it is, I think, established that I am not a fan of the pro-Palestine protests happening on college campuses all across the country. On this show just yesterday, I went into detail arguing that these protests are BLM reborn. There was always destined to be some kind of race-related protest movement in the spring and summer before the election. In 2020, it was George Floyd. This time around, it's taken the form of sympathizing with Hamas. But at bottom, it's the same people, the same activists, funded by the same wealthy backers who, just as in 2020, can ultimately be traced back to George Soros, who else? And they're angry about basically the same things, many of them, even if the conflict in Israel has nothing at all to do with racial grievances in the U.S., these activists, and the left more broadly, are still viewing it through that prism. They see Hamas as revolutionaries fighting back against white power structures and white colonialism. They see this as marginalized brown people warring against white oppressors. It's all about systemic racism. Everything is always about that. As I've said many times, they will always side with the less white side or the browner side, if that's how you want to put it. So I'm not a fan of these people or their movement. In fact, I despise everything they stand for. And I've also said, including just yesterday, that any protester breaking the law should be rounded up and dragged away in handcuffs immediately. Throw the book at any of the lawbreakers. If they're setting up illegal encampments, if they're vandalizing or causing any property damage at all, if they're engaging in any acts of violence at all, if they're making explicit threats of violence against Jewish people or any other group of people, if they're standing in the road and blocking traffic, if they're engaging in criminal activity of any kind, they should be thrown in jail. And if hundreds of them are committing crimes at once, then arrest hundreds of them, put them in buses and take them to jail. Very simple. And I've been clear about my feelings on that subject. But right now, I have a bone to pick with the other side of this dispute. And before we get to the more significant problem, I will, first of all, confess some annoyance at some of the people who have been so bold in speaking out against these protests. Take Speaker Mike Johnson, for example, who went to Columbia University yesterday to denounce the protests and call for the president of the university to resign. Watch.
Sadly, Columbia's administrators have chosen to let the threats, the fear, and the intimidation of the mob rule, to overtake American principles like free speech and the free exchange of ideas and the free exercise of religion. They have co-opted First Amendment arguments to protect genocide and to elevate the voices of anti-Semitism. They have proven themselves to be incapable of achieving their basic responsibility, which is keeping students safe. We just can't allow this kind of hatred and anti-Semitism to flourish on our campuses, and it must be stopped in its tracks. Those who are perpetrating this violence should be arrested. And I'm here today joining my colleagues and calling on President Shafiq to resign if she cannot immediately bring order to this chaos. As Speaker of the House, I am committing today that the Congress will not be silent as Jewish students are expected to run for their lives and stay home from their classes hiding in fear. In the House of Representatives, we've already acted to address anti-Semitism on campuses. We have passed a number of statutes to address this matter, and we call upon the U.S. Senate to act upon our legislation.
Okay, we'll get back to the anti-Semitism bit in a moment, but the point is that Mike Johnson was very clear about condemning this movement, and when asked about his message to Columbia students participating in the protest, here's what he said.
What is your message to the students inside the encampment right now?
My message to the students inside the encampment is go back to class and stop the nonsense. Look, if we want to have a debate on campus about the merits of these things, let's do that. But you can't intimidate your fellow students and make them stay home from class. Think about that. Is that right? Do you think that's right? Stop wasting your parents' money, Congressman Lawler says. I think that's right. Last one.
So you're wasting your parents' money, he says, and he's right. They are. I take no issue with what was said in that second clip. But it's hard not to notice a stark contrast here. You know, when it comes to the pro-Palestine demonstrations, he is bold and loud in his denunciations. But what did he have to say only a few years ago when BLM mobs were torching our cities? Now, those protests, quote unquote, were far, far, far more destructive, like by an infinite margin. What was Mike Johnson's response back then? Well, let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we?
What did you feel when you watched the video of George Floyd being killed?
I was outraged. I don't think anyone can view the video and objectively come to any other conclusion but that it was an act of murder. And I felt that initially, as everyone did. It's so disturbing. And, the underlying issues beneath that are something that the country is now struggling with. And I think it's something we have to look at very soberly and with a lot of empathy. And I'm glad to see that's happening around the country. What it's taught me is we now have 4 other children of our own. And my oldest son, Jack, ironically, this year is 14. And I've thought often through all these ordeals over the last couple of weeks about the difference in the experiences between my 2 14-year-old sons, Michael being a Black American and Jack being white, Caucasian. They have different challenges. My son, Jack, has an easier path. He just does. The interesting thing about both of these kids, Michael and Jack, is they're both handsome, articulate, really talented kids, gifted by God to do lots of things. But the reality is, and no one can tell me otherwise, my son Michael had a harder time than my son Jack is going to have simply because of the color of his skin. And that's a reality. It's an uncomfortable, painful one to acknowledge, but people have to recognize that's a fact.
What should we do about that?
I think that we really do need systematic change. I think we need transformative solutions.
Systematic change for our systemically racist country. How bold and courageous. So, turns out, Mike Johnson did not denounce the BLM rioters. He didn't hold any press conference at the site of any of these riots and condemn the protesters to their faces. He didn't tell them to go home. Instead, he went on national television and declared that George Floyd was murdered. He threw Derek Chauvin under the bus and then proceeded to validate and agree with the BLM rioters and their claims about systemic racism in America. That's what he did. And now he wants us to give him credit because he's at Columbia University making fun of the dumb college kids. I don't give him any credit for that. And I'm picking on Mike Johnson here for good reason. He's a Speaker of the House. But I could play this game with almost any Republican politician who has been vocal in their denunciations of the so-called Free Palestine movement. Almost none of them showed even a fraction of that boldness when BLM was terrorizing not just Ivy League campuses, but the entire country, whole cities, communities of normal people. Not these dumb Ivy League college kids. Regina Chaley Academy is an accredited pre-K through 12 classical homeschool hybrid academy for Catholic families in cities across the U.S. They provide in-classroom lessons 2 times a week and in-home lesson plans that support parents the other 3 days a week. Regina Chaley Academy, with your support, has provided nearly $500,000 in student tuition assistance for the 2023 to 2024 academic year. Your participation in the Courage Under Fire Gala, a significant event in our mission to evangelize, will help us continue to provide tuition assistance in the future. Come and join me on May 24th in Nashville, Tennessee for a night of encouragement and camaraderie. I'll be speaking alongside Dr. Abby Johnson and Father Calloway on how to have courage and stand up for the truth. No matter what adversity you face, we'll be joined by some of the most influential leaders in the conservative movement for a night of connection and inspiration. VIP tickets will have access to an exclusive meet and greet with all speakers. And if you can't attend, please consider donating today to support families and continue to train the heart, mind, and the soul. Every dollar counts. For tickets, visit courageunderfiregala.org and use code DailyWire at checkout. That's courageunderfiregala.org and use code DailyWire. Can't wait to see you there. Now, of course, the same can even more be said, for the people in corporate media, academia, elsewhere who have been speaking out against the campus protests this month. All of them, literally all of them, were on the side of these same activists 4 years ago when those activists were looting and burning our cities. Now, this is not just some cheap gotcha moment. The point is that most of these people pretending to be shocked and appalled by the campus protests are at least partially to blame for them. You validated these activists and their tactics. In fact, you validated tactics much worse, much more destructive, much more disruptive than this. And now you're speaking out without ever acknowledging your own role in this or apologizing for your cowardice. And why are you speaking out now? Why now, but not back then? Well, because the BLM movement of 2020 was anti-white, and it is not safe to denounce anti-whiteism, which is why Mike Johnson never has denounced it and never, ever, ever will. And we all know that. It is much safer and much more acceptable in polite society to denounce anti-Semitism. So they're happy to do so. There's nothing wrong with denouncing anti-Semitism, of course, Anti-Semitism, actual anti-Semitism, which is the hatred of Jewish people for being Jewish, is evil and should be denounced, and very often is denounced by both sides of the political divide. However sincere or insincere that may be with their denunciations, they do denounce it all the time. But hating white people for being white is evil too. And yet again, most of these people have never once, not once ever, not ever, explicitly condemned that kind of bigotry or even acknowledged that it exists. And that imbalance and double standard really matters. It does. So that's my first issue with some of the people on the other side. Here's my second. Yesterday, students at University of Texas at Austin joined in the protest fun, but they were greeted with a much different response from what their comrades on other campuses have experienced. As soon as they began their walkout, police were on the scene and making arrests. Watch. So the whole video is kind of like that. So according to CBS News, at least 30 of the UT protesters were arrested. And why were they arrested? Were they threatening violence? Were they setting up illegal encampments? Was this an unlawful assembly? Maybe so. But we can't know for sure based on that video. You can't really tell. So it's up to those in a position of authority to communicate with us. They have to tell us why they are making these arrests. And especially when you're arresting protesters in the middle of a political demonstration, it is very important to be clear about why you're doing it. So what did Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, say? Well, yesterday afternoon, he retweeted that video of law enforcement swarming the area, and he said this, quote, "Arrests being made right now and will continue until the crowd disperses. These protesters belong in jail. Anti-Semitism will not be tolerated in Texas, period. Students joining in hate-filled anti-Semitic protests at any public college or university in Texas should be expelled." Now, there are plenty of conservatives who have tried to twist themselves into pretzel-like shapes in search of some defensible interpretation of Greg Abbott's own words. But we should not have to twist ourselves into any shape for the sake of our political leaders. That's not our job. Your job is to communicate clearly, especially in a time like this. And the clear, simple, most direct interpretation of Abbott's statement is that these protesters are being arrested for being anti-Semitic. Again, quote, "These protesters belong in jail. Anti-Semitism will not be tolerated in Texas." Okay, if you tell me that that does not indicate that they're being arrested for anti-Semitism, then you are being intentionally stupid and you know it. Stop it. The only way to avoid interpreting this as a direction for protesters to be arrested for their anti-Semitic views is to assume that the first sentence in that statement has nothing to do with the second sentence. Like these are two completely separate, unrelated thoughts that just happen to be put into the same tweet for no particular reason. But that is absurd, of course. And anyone interpreting it that way is being willfully obtuse. And again, if you're in that category, you know it, and I know it, so just cut it out. So we are left with two possibilities. Either Greg Abbott really did direct law enforcement to arrest protesters for being anti-Semitic, or he wants us to think that he did. Either they are being hauled away in handcuffs for anti-Semitism, or they're being hauled away for actually breaking the law, but Greg Abbott is presenting it as a crackdown on anti-Semitism. In either case, it's a problem. It is a very big problem, in fact. And that is because anti-Semitic speech is not illegal, okay? Now, directly calling for or inciting violence is illegal, and if somebody does that, then arrest them for that. Arrest them right away and tell us that's what you're doing. But anti-Semitic speech more broadly, that is speech that conveys a hatred for or opposition towards Jews, is not illegal. You are allowed to hate Jews or any other group in this country. You cannot make it illegal to simply hate a group of people or say that you hate them. Or you can do that, but if you do, free speech is over. It's just done. If we have free speech at all, then that umbrella must cover what we now call hate speech. And this is entirely leaving aside the question of whether all of these protesters actually do hate Jews. And I think it's clear that many of them don't. Some of them are Jewish themselves. Others are there because, as established, they see Israel as a white Western power, and that's why they hate it. Others are there just because they want to protest something and they don't care about the reason or know about the reason. We just heard from one of those people. She doesn't even know why she's there. And others are there because they oppose Israel as a political entity, but not Jews as people. And then some are there, yes, because they hate Jewish people. That crowd is certainly present at many of these protests. You can hear them. It's absurd to deny all of these other motivations and reasons and assume that all of them are protesting just for that last reason. But even if they were, it shouldn't matter legally, because legally we have the First Amendment. Now, if free speech does not include the kind of speech society judges to be most vile and unpleasant, then there's no such thing as free speech. If protesters don't have the First Amendment right to express views that those in power find especially detestable, then they don't have the First Amendment. You know, if the governor declares, you have the right to say whatever you want, except for that, because that's really mean. Well, if that is declared, then clearly you do not have the right to say what you want. It's not hard to see what happens next once this precedent is set. If the governor can send the cops in and have you arrested for being anti-Semitic, if he can declare, indeed, that anti-Semitic speech will not be tolerated in his state at all, which is what he said, then why can't you also be arrested for so-called homophobic speech or transphobic speech or racist speech? Is it now up to the governor of each state to decide which forms of hateful speech will be tolerated and which will not be tolerated? Is that what it means to live in a supposedly free country? There are many forms of bigotry, yet there's only one that Greg Abbott has decided will not be tolerated in Texas. He certainly never declared during the BLM riots that anti-whiteism won't be tolerated. He appears to have a lot of tolerance for that. Well, that's why our free speech rights should not hinge on the tolerance and preferences of our political leaders. You as the leader might find this form of hate to be especially appalling, even more than other forms. I don't care. I don't give a damn what you personally feel is worse. That shouldn't make a difference. You're allowed to have your opinion. You can't arrest people according to that. No one has the right to directly call for or threaten violence against anyone. But you do have the right to hate whoever you want and to express that hatred verbally. I'm not saying hatred is good. I'm not recommending it. But you have the right. Human beings experience hate and they talk like you. Yes, you have the right to do that. It's that simple. If we legitimize the criminalization of so-called hate speech, we embrace the final destruction of the First Amendment. And we invite the left to use this as a weapon against us, which they will. And happily so. And that's why Greg Abbott is, once again, I'm afraid to say, canceled. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.